Dear friends, welcome to ePathshala. I am Dr. Vishal Jadhav, Department of Sociology, Tilak Maharashtra Vidyapeeth, Pune. Today we are going to look at a module titled Development, Rights and the Poor, which is part of the political sociology paper. What do we understand by the term development? Does development mean only economic growth, or does it also mean political rights? Does it mean access to resources? Does it mean the access to capabilities? Does it also mean human rights? This particular module will try and address such issues, and it will also discuss the whole discourse on development as it emerged in the world in the 1950s. It will also discuss about the politics of global institutions such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund and the Asia Development Banks. It will talk about how and what is the relationship between power, state and citizens. Development, rights and the poor. A look at the historical background will reveal that the legitimation has come from the pro-development scholarship with its roots in modernization theory. It championed the global north's notion of development, while the global south was blamed for its failure to reach up to the former's standards. From the 1950s that espoused the Keynesian worldview to the 1970s deregulation of the international finance and to the 1980s removal of trade barriers, the modernization model has undergone several transformations to its current emphasis on fiscal austerity, currency devaluation, market liberalization and public sector liberalization. Barring India, China and South Korea, the global south unanimously accepted this model as the only path to progress. Development as a right. Moreover, development got institutionalized as a right, adopted in 1986 by the United Nations General Assembly, the Declaration on the Right to Development. The right-based approach delineates two groups: right holders, those who lack the rights, and duty bearers, who have to ensure the fulfilling of rights. The approach emphasizes on the accountability of state policies and endows people with claims. Secondly, it insists on ensuring that the development process is accountable, transparent, and enables every individual to have access to the fruits of the progress. More importantly, it is meant to assure more chances for equitable participation, guaranteed by proper institutional mechanisms, and grant self-sufficiency to the vulnerable sections of society. Participation has undergone a metamorphosis, as it is no longer about measuring the needs of beneficiaries, but about nurturing citizens to stake claims and responsible mechanisms to fulfill their duties. In addition, the right-based approach enables that accountability is not only limited to the state but expands to include even non-state actors like the donor community, intergovernmental organizations and international non-governmental organizations. An instance of keeping tabs on accountability is the way financial assistance is now provided under this approach, from sector-specific project-based interventions to direct budget support to the government. According to Andrea Cornwall and Celestine Nyamu Musembi, this enables the donor country to influence to some extent the beneficiary government's policy. Cornwall and Nyamu Musembi states that rights-based approach provides a normative structure which is based on international covenants and conventions for shaping development cooperation by highlighting what ought to be. They claim that it repoliticizes development work which had so far been instrumentalist. Development agencies are now coerced to shift from the earlier stance of unreflective patronage to the self-aware exercise of agency to help the vulnerable masses. It is pertinent here to mention the difference between the earlier need-based welfare approach and the present right-based approach. Unlike the need-based welfare approach, which emphasized upon acquiring resources to deliver services to some groups, a right-based approach demands resources to be shared equitably and aiding the vulnerable to stake claims to these resources. The former model stemmed from altruistic motives and perceived the vulnerable sections of society as objects of charity instead of empowering them. The latter, on the other hand, is rooted in legal duties and perceives the marginalized as rights holders. While work to build political capacities and to raise political consciousness, as well as efforts to enhance participation in social change, had been underway even before this approach was introduced. Yet, there is no denying that the international legal backing of the right-based approach has engendered a more radicalized development process. Trajectory of right-based approach to development. Cornwall and Nyamu-Musembi state that starting from the era of colonialism to the World War II, the concept of development to be pursued by economists was considered to be separate from human rights, to be pursued by lawyers and activists. The 1960s and 1970s saw attempts to narrow the gap between the two. As newly independent states of Global South became members of the United Nations, started putting forth their demands. Peter Owen too identifies three phases that witness the convergence of the development discourse with that of human rights. Firstly, the missionary zeal following the Cold War. Secondly, the drive for good governance due to the failure of the structural adjustment program. Thirdly, the need for adding an extra dimension to the definition of development other than economic growth. Owen particularly traces the inclusion of development into the human rights lexicon to the debate on the right to development first proposed in 1972 by the Senegalese jurist Mabé. It was an important addition to the hitherto existing political and civil human rights. Owen points out that the early 1970s witnessed vigorous debates and discussions among the Third World nationalist leaders regarding the need for global redistribution of resources. It was only in 1986 that the UN General Assembly passed a resolution called the UN Declaration on the Right of Development, which empowers each individual to partake and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development to ensure the achievement of their human rights. The positives, as per Cornwall and Nyamu-Musembi, were that it went beyond the state-citizen relationship and focused on the collective duty of all states throughout the world to foster an environment to attain rights. It also entreated the industrially advanced nation states to get rid of the obstacles like debt burdens and unjust trade regulations, as well as lending assistance to the countries struggling to get a foothold in the international economic arena. Unfortunately, the second half of the resolution was diluted by the global north countries as they voted against it. Also, since the declaration was sans any binding powers, the fallout was that it did not carry any obligations for the first world to transfer resources. This reeked of asymmetrical power relations. But in 1993, Owen states that there was a new ray of hope as the World Conference on Human Rights, Vienna, espoused the right to development, reflecting greater legal agreement globally. More specifically, the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action emphasized on the ties between democracy, sustainability, and development. It also emphasized on the indivisibility, imprescriptibility, that is, rights cannot be discontinued if they are not used properly or not used for a long time. Interdependence and non-hierarchical nature of right, economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights. Another upside is that it later paved the way for the World Social Development Summit at Copenhagen in 1995, when humanitarian NGOs and development agencies came together to wage a more spirited campaign for a right-based approach. This too was not without criticisms, as Slynn, Rogers, and Obiora accused it of replacing earlier rights, rife with contradiction and the lack of clarity on the question of accountable parties. Owen states that development agencies like UNDP and World Bank made self-congratulatory claims about how they had already ensured human rights through their programs. Their mere rhetoric did not translate into concrete actions on the ground. Jack Donnelly and Michael Windfer add that this kind of discourse only served to relegate human rights to a secondary subset status. Sustainable human development was believed to be subsumed and automatically guarantee human rights, and hence the differences between the two were glossed over. In other cases, any reference to the right to development was conveniently excluded, since it highlighted the global asymmetrical power equation. The UK Department for International Development, Cornwall and Nyamo Musembi point out, did not mention it in its poverty reduction strategy papers. Irwin states that human rights itself had been attached as a sidebar to good governance mission in the 1990s. For instance, the World Bank in 1998 claimed that since it improved accountability and transparency of governance and modernized financial institutions, it had guaranteed that human rights can be attained by individuals. Irwin is highly critical of such a discourse as it claims that the trope of human rights is a convenient smokescreen to legitimize policies that are intended to boost free trade and enable the MNCs to pursue national assets, thus reinforcing the status quo and brushing under the carpet controversial topics like colonialism, asymmetrical environmental destruction, and the problems of structural adjustment. The 2000s ushered in a change in the definition of development. Development and human rights were reconceptualized as two sides of the same coin. Amartya Sen in Development as Freedom states that the development is the expansion of capabilities or substantive human freedoms, the capacity to lead the kind of life she reasons to value. Sen identifies poverty, inadequate economic opportunities, neglect of public facilities, and intolerance as hurdles to realizing freedom. More importantly, he elucidated that freedom was an essential constitutive element of development. Irwin claims that this is not novel since the UN Secretary General's Agenda for Development had already identified in 1994 that democracy is crucial for development. It had declared that to the extent democracy exists in a country, a significant human right which empowers people to partake in the decision-making process, development is possible. Yet, it was commendable that Sen's work prompted practical action. UNDP's Human Development Report of 2000 had subsequently charted out some measures like prompting human rights norms, promoting right enabling, economic environment, strengthening the network of human rights organizations. Irwin opines that the sanctity of economic growth remains intact and the potential for this conceptualization to fructify into meaningful, concrete action remains unexplored. Thus, the formulation of a right-based approach to development had to undergo several legal wrangles and vigorous discussions and continues to be scrutinized and redefined. At present, the right-based approach has no doubt formulated the relationship between the state and its citizen. It ensures that there is not simply a service-oriented relationship between the state and its citizens, but is a social guarantee that ensures justice for the vulnerable sections of society. It entails a transition from perceiving human rights as benchmark utilized to measure development programs towards redirecting the programs to achieve human rights. Paul Greedy states that since there is a deeper convergence between development and human rights, the rights have become less declaratory and more operational now. Critique of development. Over the years, the very idea of development was attacked on two fronts. Initially, owing to protest campaigns that berated its unfulfilled claim, and later through theoretical scrutiny, particularly that of post-structuralism in the 1990s, which questioned its desirability. The latter also contended that development was a singular, top-down project of domination by global North states, capital, and professional experts. Michael Goldman, in The Imperial Nature, traces the roots of the development discourse to the World Bank. He argues that the bank deviously defines the problems supposedly ailing the third world, for example, rural poverty in India or rebuilding of Afghanistan in the post-war era, and then provides the solutions to correct them. This implicitly implies a dependence on global North's bank for loans to purchase aids from North's firms, from tractors to turbines to expertise of professional consultants. So the flow of capital is always unilateral from the South to the North. What Goldman especially highlights is the insidious ways the bank exports this idea to the developing countries by positioning itself as policy maker, global lender, civil society actor, and knowledge producer. Contrary to this claim, most of the development projects by the World Bank do not appear to have much pragmatic value. For instance, Goldman cites the irrigation canal project in Thar Desert, which was projected as a triumph by the government, could not fulfill the promise of equitable distribution of water since the canal was improperly lined. Only the rich landowners raked in the profit while the small farmers suffered. Unfortunately, this is not simply an isolated instance. There are thousands of other such cases where the region's capitalist class has got empowered owing to development projects. Hence, Goldman insists that we need to subject the development paradigm to a critical scrutiny. Dependency theory proposed in 1950s was especially critical to the idea that economic growth in industrially advanced countries leads to growth in the industrially backward counterpart. It identified certain binaries like dominant, dependent, center, periphery, and metropolitan satellite categories. While the former category includes industrially advanced nations in the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development or OECD, the later category includes Asia, Africa, and Latin America, having minimal gross national products or GNPs, exporting very few products, foreign exchange earnings, and importing large number of products from Western developed nations. The former extorts cheap labor and raw material of the latter. Renowned Marxist theorist Andre Gunder-Frank highlights the historical trajectory of underdevelopment in the Third World. He argues that the current underdevelopment can be traced to the historical and persisting exploitative relationship between the developed metropolitan nations and the impoverished satellite nations, the inevitable fallout of the international capitalist system. While the metropolitan countries became progressively richer and developed, the satellite countries became progressively poorer and backward, which Frank calls the development of the underdevelopment. Thus, in contrast to the modernization theory, the dependency theory rejects the idea that underdevelopment of satellite regions stems from their own internal fault and inefficiencies. Underdevelopment is not, as Emile Jeffrey puts it, an original state but introduced into a pre-capitalist society due to its unfair, unequal economic and political exchanges with capitalist countries. Eminent environmentalist Vandana Shiva also launched a scathing attack on the destructive nature of development projects that celebrate the progressive domination of nature. Theories like Ars and Long suggest that alternative strategies of development will help generate multiple models of modernity. The solution put forth by the dependency theorist was that satellite nations must disconnect from the metropolitan centers and pursue a process of internal growth. Shiva ventures to offer an alternative in the form of ecofeminism, linking environmental damage to women's oppression. It stresses the role of women in sustainable development and the effectiveness of their farming practices. Even the right-based approach, which promises to correct the deficiencies within development, has not been immune to the criticism. Cornwall and Nyamo Musembi point out that the marginalized may not be able to stake any claims if they do not have access to the implementing institutions. Also, the process of recognizing and claiming rights is compounded by the presence of a plethora of legal systems that monitor and determine the access to entitlements. More importantly, as the group Sustainable Livelihoods in Southern Africa points out, people do not rely excessively on formal legal systems but may use different stratagems to achieve their rights outside the institutional framework. John Farrington adds that the principle of indivisibility advocated by right-based approach is just not feasible when there are limited resources and certain rights have to be privileged over the others. Malcolm Malone and Derek Belshaw aver that approach is oblivious to the fact that all development targets are not of equal importance, feasibility and cost. The accountability of international NGOs and bilateral development institutions to the beneficiary communities as well as to the recipient state governments is still questionable, given their reliance on the financial largesse of the first world nations. Similarly, recipient state governments too do not owe to the donor countries to be transparent since there is not much legal enforcement. The ambiguity regarding the accompanying duties helps water down the potential of the approach, which may be a reason Cornwall and Nyamo Musembi speculate why first world nations have endorsed it instead of the right to development. In addition, Srilata Batliwala points out that the individual focus of the rights discourse is problematic and the focus needs to shift to collective rights. She states that the present set of rights from a European Rousseauian viewpoint of the individual as both the object and subject of rights have become the goal of modern-day civilizing project in the non-Western world. Batliwala adds that the rights-based approach is conceptualized in such broad terms that the duty bearers can shirk off their responsibility by claiming the policies already integrated human rights. In addition, Hugo Slim vehemently argues that discussing about claims, entitlements and rights are contingent upon the location of the individual or group. Slim insists that development agencies seriously reflect on their location. There is always an inherent danger of their interventions that promise participation and rights being driven by neo-colonialist and imperialist motives. Cornwall and Nyamo Musembi adds that a right-based approach to development cooperation tends to depend upon external pressures and harps on good governance as the only solution to minimizing poverty. This reeks of condescension by the donor first world nation towards third world nations, particularly they assume superiority in determining the best interests of the latter. Development at what cost? There are several instances of development projects rendering various sections of society poor, vulnerable and marginalized. A look at some of the development projects throughout the world reveals the disastrous after effects of some development projects. Two of the particular fallouts of development projects are acquisition of lands and zoning attempts. Impact of land acquisition. Over the years, there has been an escalated spate of land acquisitions in the country. For instance, in 2011, at Bhatta Parsaul village in Greater Noida, fertile agricultural land was snatched away from the farmers for the 8-lane Yamuna Expressway. In Orissa, in Bali Mela Reservoir displaced 250 villages, which isolated them from the mainland, preventing government supplies from reaching them. Arjan Dehan and Amresh Dubey point out that around 3 to 5 million people have been forced to evacuate since 1950, out of which 50% are composed of tribal population. Already 184 industrial projects have been approved, of which would require extraction of minerals, resulting further in the impoverishment of the region. This despite the fact that the acquisition drive had clearly contravened the Forest Rights Act of 2006. Those whose lands were acquired were absorbed into menial jobs, mainly as wage-paid labor. In fact, the Lambada tribal communities in Andhra Pradesh actually sold their land and instead of uncertain agricultural livelihood, settled for gangmen's job in railways. This ensured living quarters, health facilities and education for their children. Those who tilled their own land or were dependent on forests have been reduced to being landless workers, doing odd jobs for a living and leading a life of penury. For example, in Dharma Jaigar block of Raigad district, Chhattisgarh, members of the Gond and Arao tribe have been displaced by Sterlite Balco company that has occupied 1070 hectares. The tribes have lost a source of income. Forests produce like mahua and tendua leaf. They have now been forced to be rack pickers and daily wage laborers. The land acquisition drive has also eroded traditional land rights, destroying their resource-based livelihood and their homes. Also, their social organization and cultural identity have been threatened, making them vulnerable to exploitation. The discontent and conflict stemming from land alienation have often erupted in Naxalite violence. Land acquisition for development is not a recent phenomenon in the country. In the early years of independence, land was acquired from various regions for the construction of huge dams. During the setting up of the Hirakud Dam in 1948, the then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru had told displaced villagers, "If you are to suffer, you should suffer in the interest of the country." This pattern of exploitation has intensified further today. For instance, the Mithi Virdi nuclear energy plant, an ambitious project estimated to be around Rs 64,000 crore, has been launched by the government in Gujarat. Under the pretext that the salinity of land had rendered it unsuitable for farming, the latter allocated considerable plots of land to various companies. However, it threatens to evict 15,000 people from 24 villages. They also stand to lose a very profitable livelihood, mango and coconut farming, which brings extensive projects. What's worse is that at the public hearing organized for the project, the villagers were not allowed to voice their concerns. Even the environmental impact assessment report was not revealed. Most of the public hearings of development projects are a sham. Only the beneficiaries, the nearby towns, residents get to speak, while the pleas of those victimized are sidestepped. For instance, a recent writ petition was filed in Chhattisgarh High Court accuses DB Power Limited, one of the group's companies, of using illegal measures through company-owned newspapers to influence the outcome of a public hearing over an open-cast coal mine. This illustrates that the present model of development is exclusionary and hardly participatory in true sense. Impact of zoning. Goldman argues that notwithstanding its promise of sustainable development, the World Bank continues the same destructive activities as before, peddling old wine, new bottle, green neoliberalism, that is, development projects that promise to be eco-friendly, have become a deadly weapon in its armory, helping it intervene in Eastern Europe and Global South. The latter's network of developmental agencies, governments, NGOs, and chambers of commerce further transplanted into their architecture of local governing institutions, thus foreclosing any other imagination of development and sustainability. In Mumbai, that 70,000 workers' dwellings occupying Borivali National Park were cleared away. The environmental group which lobbied for it blamed them for sullying the land. The government further aggravated matters by demanding that they pay Rs 7,000 for allotment of land as well as finance their own schools and houses. In retaliation to such acts of enclosure, varied protests by indigenous communities are surfacing on the horizon. Pat Lauderdale states that whether it be the Mapuche in Argentina protesting against oil contamination, the struggle against deforestation in the Amazonia and Congo Basin, the resistance against uranium poisoning by tribals in Jharkhand belt, India, or the anger of Marinduque Islanders in Philippines, is certain that the development projects are not being uncritically accepted by the local residents. No doubt, the post-development theories justifiably criticize the development discourse, but at the same time, there is a need to be cautious about rejecting anything associated with developed model of the West and uncritically championing the local traditions. One of the faults of the post-development literature, according to its critics, is that it tends to neglect the real interests of the people and especially their needs for livelihood. In this module, therefore, we have seen how the discourse on development moves from the modernization theory, which talks about a very teleological movement from underdevelopment to modernization. It talks about the dependency theory, in which there is a power relation between the global north and the global south. It also talks about the capability approach that Amartya Sen had discussed. It also talks about the human rights approach. Development, therefore, is not only economic, not only political, and not only social. It is all encompassing, and it talks about human rights. It talks about being a human. Thank you.